Okay, so we're going to do a lesson here on planning utilitarianism essays, and this is a general lesson here which applies to any essays really that you could get on utilitarianism, and kind of works through how you go about planning them, how you go about thinking about how you would plan them. So here are some questions that I've just taken from past papers, and you can see here that they range from talking about Mill's utilitarianism, applying utilitarianism, thinking about distinctive features of particular types of utilitarianism, general principles of utilitarianism, and so on. So obviously a great way of revising is to go on the AQA website, go on the past papers section, download as many past papers as you can, and plan past paper questions. Brilliant way to revise. And obviously here just to mention that all of these essays are AO1 30 mark questions which test your knowledge and understanding. However, the principles behind this particular lesson that we're doing now will apply to AO2 essays as well. So what I've done here is just taken aspects of the mark scheme, and what I've focused on here is this aspect of relevance, and really relevance is absolutely key if you want to progress up these levels towards those 25, 26 mark essays, getting into those A essays. And if we work right from level 0, so 0 marks, nothing of relevance whatsoever, and working our way up, we can see little related knowledge to that particular question. Level 2, again, little relevant material to that particular question. Going up to a level 4, level 5, key ideas and facts are included. But then as you get up to that level 6, level 7, it is about mostly accurate and relevant to the question, and that is absolutely key. If you want to access those higher marks, the material you select to answer the question must be relevant to the question set. What differentiates good answers from really good answers is how relevant the information that is selected to answer that particular question is, and that is absolutely key. So what you don't want to do is just spout out a general essay to a question that, for example, asks about Mill. You don't want to just give an essay which generally talks about utilitarianism, because that is not all going to be relevant to that essay specifically on Mill. So the question is, how do we actually go about planning for relevance? And the way I see it, relevance is about the similarities and differences between different aspects of what we've learnt about utilitarianism, and being able to see the similarities and differences and what is relevant to a particular aspect of utilitarianism will help you to plan for that relevance. So the things that we've covered are the general principles of utilitarianism. We've looked at Bentham, we've looked at Mill, we've looked at act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. So what we're going to do in this lesson is take each of these and think about what is specific to those aspects of utilitarianism, and that will enable us to see the similarities and differences, which will mean that we can then plan for a particular question that could come up. So we'll start off with the general principles of utilitarianism. So what is it that all utilitarians believe? So whether you're talking about Mill, whether you're talking about Act, whether you're talking about Bentham or whatever, these 4 things are going to be included in any essay, because they are things which all utilitarians believe. And if you get a question on the general principles of utilitarianism, these 4 things is what that means. It means a reference to it being a teleological or consequential theory, reference to its basis in hedonism, and then that developing into the principle of utility and the greatest happiness principle. So the first aspect there, utilitarianism is a teleological or consequential theory, and as we know, that means the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by its outcome or consequence. And obviously, as we know, the desired outcome for utilitarians is happiness. So it doesn't matter what type of utilitarian you are really, it's all about the outcomes. The rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by its outcomes, and that outcome should be happiness. Now this is something which would probably go into an introduction for any utilitarianism essay. Okay, so the next general principle of utilitarianism is its basis in hedonism. So Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, was a hedonist, and what that means is he observed that we naturally seek pleasure. And we've talked about the dentist example where you go to the dentist offers you two options, either to pull your tooth out with a painkiller or without it, and pretty much everybody would ask for the option with the painkiller. And what Bentham says is that shows that we think that pleasure is good, pain is bad. And so hedonism is the belief that pleasure is the sole good, pain is the sole bad. So following on from that, that's kind of the basis of utilitarianism, and then that develops into this idea of the principle of utility. And so hedonism, the belief that pleasure is good, pain is bad, for a utilitarian, pleasure equals happiness. And so what the principle of utility says is that anything which is useful for creating happiness is moral. That's what the principle of utility is. That is the kind of underlying principle behind utilitarianism. So again, for all utilitarians, that then develops into the greatest happiness principle, which is the more people that are made happy by an action, the more useful it is, and therefore the more moral it is. And so just to summarise that, the greatest happiness principle is the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So that is something that all utilitarians believe in. Whatever type of utilitarian you are, it is about creating the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. Okay, so we've talked about the general principles of utilitarianism. So if you got an essay on Bentham, then what would you include? Well, you would obviously include those four things which are general to all utilitarians, because Bentham is obviously a utilitarian. But then what is different about Bentham is his hedonic calculus and the fact that he is an act utilitarian. So we'll take those last two now in a bit more detail, because we've already talked about the first four. Okay, so Bentham came up with the hedonic calculus because he'd obviously developed the greatest happiness principle, and so he needs a way to work out what would create the most happiness for the most people. And so what he developed was the hedonic calculus, which is a test to help us calculate which choice of action in a moral dilemma will create the most happiness and therefore is the most moral. And so what you would need to do is, for all of the possible actions that you have in a moral dilemma, you put them through the hedonic calculus, and that calculates which one will create the most happiness, and whichever one creates the most happiness, that is the one that you should do because it's most moral. And remember our acronym PRICED here. These are the 7 criteria of the hedonic calculus. So we've got purity, remoteness, repetition, intensity, certainty, extent, and duration. Okay, and no, I didn't just have a list, I do know them, and you can know them too. It's just about learning them, revising them, having them in your head off by heart. So what Bentham says is that you put an action through the hedonic calculus by assessing them against each of those criteria, and whichever one comes out with the highest amount of happiness, that is the one that you should do. So another slightly different aspect then of Bentham's utilitarianism in particular, so if you got an essay specifically to do with Bentham, is the fact that he is an act utilitarian. And so for Bentham, all that matters is that whatever action you choose, that creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number. In other words, for Bentham, what is important is the quantity of happiness that actions produce. So what that means is that the amount of happiness actions can produce must be calculated relative to each and every situation that you're in. In other words, there are no rules. Bentham does not follow rules. What he says is that in every single situation that you are in, every possible action, hence act utilitarianism, the amount of happiness that each of those actions could produce needs to be calculated in each and every situation separately. So that is what act utilitarianism is. And if we want to summarise that using technical language, what that means is that the principle of utility and the greatest happiness principle are applied in each and every situation separately. So, in other words, what you do is you work out in every single situation that you are in, completely independently, what action is going to create the most happiness, and therefore that is what you will do. Irrelevant what the action is, as long as it creates the most happiness for the most people, that is the action that you do. So that is something that all act utilitarians believe, and so they agree with Bentham there. However, just be careful when you talk about act utilitarianism, because not all act utilitarians would agree that the way to work out what creates the greatest amount of happiness in each situation, not all would agree with Bentham that the way to do that is to use the hedonic calculus. That is something specific to Bentham's utilitarianism. Okay then, so moving on to the specific aspects of Mill's utilitarianism, so what's unique about him. Again, those first four things are there, those first four general principles of utilitarianism are there, so you would again keep them in, but then the bottom three here on the list, these are specific to Mill. His higher and lower pleasures, the principle of universalizability, and the fact that he is associated with rule utilitarianism. So if you got an essay on Mill, those bottom three there definitely need to be in, as well as the general principles. Okay, so we don't need to go into those first four again because we've already done them, but let's talk about the bottom three. So the first one here, higher and lower pleasures. So Mill was obviously a student of Bentham, but he disagreed with Bentham that if you just base the utility, i.e. the usefulness and therefore morality of an action, purely on quantity, he didn't like that idea because that could allow you to do undesirable things like bullying. Because as long as the greatest number of people are happy, the action is moral. So if you have 5 bullies bullying one person and those 5 bullies are happier than the one person, then that makes the bullying moral. And Mill did not like the idea that an ethical theory could justify actions like that. So what he said was that the utility of an action, its usefulness and therefore morality, should not just be about the quantity of happiness, but it must also be about the quality. And this is where his famous quote comes in here, that it's better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So what he's saying there is that the quality of some pleasures are so high that even a tiny amount of that pleasure is better than a huge amount of a lower pleasure. So it's better to be a Socrates, a clever person, seeking these higher pleasures and just getting tiny bits of that, than it is to seek the same pleasures that a pig would seek. And so what that does then is that means that lots of undesirable actions are not allowed if they are lower pleasures. So going back to our previous example of bullying, bullying wouldn't be allowed because it's a lower pleasure. So even if it created a greater amount of happiness, it's a lower pleasure and therefore not something that we should pursue. So he differentiates between higher and lower pleasures. Higher pleasures are the intellectual pleasures, reading, going to the opera, philosophy and so on, and those are long-term pleasures. So what he says is that over a longer period of time, the quality of that happiness would be so great that it would outweigh even a huge amount of a lower pleasure. And what he means by lower pleasures are bodily or physical pleasures, things that pigs would want to seek, things like drinking, eating, and so on. And these are short-term pleasures, so things which you might get instant gratification from eating a pizza, but after it's finished, it's gone. Whereas you might read the encyclopedia, that might not give you pleasure in the short term, however, in the long term, it will give you a greater quality, a greater amount of happiness, because you go through your life knowing everything and being intellectual, and that is a greater quality of pleasure in the long term. Okay, so the second distinctive feature of Mill's utilitarianism is the principle of universalizability. Now, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because there is another video on Mr. Gilbert's guides about the principle of universalizability, so have a look at that. But just make sure that you keep Mill's ideas about higher and lower pleasures and the principle of universalizability and rule utilitarianism completely separate. They are not the same thing. They are distinctive features of his theory. They are not to be confused. Do not get them mixed up. He is not a rule utilitarian because he believes in higher and lower pleasures. Okay, so that is very, very important. So, principle of universalizability, what he says is that society is just a collection of individuals. If we want society to be happy, individuals need to be happy, and so what we need to do is protect each individual's rights to happiness. And so the only actions which are moral are those which are universalizable. In other words, things which can be done whilst protecting everyone's rights to happiness. And that is basically the principle of universalizability. Now what that means is that then no one is exploited, nobody is used for the happiness of others, and therefore that protects the minority. So again, going back to the bullying example, the person being bullied, bullying would not be justifiable because it is not universalizable, because it takes away that person who's being bullied's right to happiness, and therefore, because that action would not be justified, that's protecting that minority, and it's also meaning that undesirable actions are not allowed. Okay, and then finally, Mill is classed as a rule utilitarian, and so because he believes in the principle of universalizability and that we need to protect each individual's rights to happiness, the easiest way to do that is to create a set of rules which, if everybody followed, will generally create the most amount of happiness whilst protecting everybody's right to happiness as well. Now, as we said with Bentham and the hedonic calculus, all rule utilitarians agree with Mill that we should create rules which, if everyone followed, would generally create most happiness. However, they don't all follow his principle of universalizability. So again, just be careful, don't say that all rule utilitarians agree with the principle of universalizability, because they don't. And so again, just to summarise using technical language, the principle of utility and the greatest happiness principle are applied to generate a set of happiness-making rules, which are then followed in all situations. So that is what rule utilitarianism is. So again, if you have a look at the other video on Mill, I go into that in a bit more detail. So we've talked about the distinctive and similar features of Bentham and Mill, and so if you got an essay on act utilitarians, again you would need to think what's similar between all utilitarians and what is distinctive about act utilitarians. So again, those first four things are there, and when you talk about the principle of utility and the greatest happiness principle in relation to act utilitarianism, what you're talking about there is how those two things are applied in each and every situation separately. That's the key to act utilitarianism. It's also associated with Bentham, and so therefore you would talk about the hedonic calculus, but only in reference to Bentham, making sure that you don't suggest that all act utilitarians follow the hedonic calculus. And then finally, if you got a question on rule utilitarianism, again, those first four general principles of what all utilitarians believe in are there, but again, the principle of utility, greatest happiness principle, here you'll talk about how they're used to create rules which, if everybody followed, would generally create the most amount of happiness in society. You talk about how rule utilitarianism is associated with Mill, and then because of that you would talk about the principle of universalizability, but just specifically referencing Mill as believing in that, and then how that leads him to be associated with rule utilitarianism. So as we've done in class, I've created this table here of down the left hand side, the left hand column. These are all of the different things that we've learnt about utilitarianism. Along the top there, they're the different things you could get asked a question on, and so the ticks there obviously show that if you got a question, for example, on Bentham, you would have to include teleological, hedonism, principle of utility, greatest happiness principle, hedonic calculus, act, and obviously talk about Bentham. Okay, so you can see there that that is a really nice way of seeing what should be included in different essays. So let's put that into practice. Here's a question: explain the general principles of utilitarianism, including reference to both act and rule utilitarianism. So just selecting those three columns there from that previous table, you would then need to talk about those general principles of utilitarianism. So what do all utilitarians believe in? So the teleological, the hedonism, the principle of utility, greatest happiness principle, and then specifically it's asking you to talk about act and rule. So then what you would need to do is for ACT, talk about the hedonic calculus, talk about ACT, rule utilitarianism generally, and you need to reference Bentham, and for rule you would reference Mill and talk about the principle of universalizability. So here is that essay planned out for you. So in the introduction we've got the idea of teleological or consequential, and then you could contrast that to deontological to get those diversity marks. Paragraph 1 then, paragraph 1 to what we're on, 1 and 2 here, they're the general principles. So if you look at the question, it's really asking you to do three things. It's asking you to talk about the general principles of utilitarianism, to talk about the specific features of ACT utilitarianism and the specific features of rule utilitarianism. So the first kind of 3 paragraphs really, including the introduction here, they're that bit there of the essay on general principles. Then from paragraph 3, that's when you would talk about ACT utilitarianism generally, so talking about how in each situation you need to work out what's going to create the most happiness. Paragraph 4, you talk about how Bentham is an ACT utilitarianism and how to use the hedonic calculus to work out what creates the most happiness. Paragraph 5, talk about rule utilitarianism, and paragraph 6, talk about rule utilitarianism in relation to Mill and the principle of universalizability. So if you reference that back to that table from the previous slide, all of those things are included in that essay, and that's key. So here's another essay, explain both the general principles of utilitarianism and the distinctive features of Mill. So again here, I've selected those 2 columns, the utilitarianism generally, and then Mill. And so what we would need to include are those first 4 things: hedonism, principle of utility, teleological and greatest happiness principle, and then because we're talking about Mill here, we'd be talking about higher and lower, principle of universalizability, and rule. So here is that essay planned out for you. So again, first 3 paragraphs including the introduction, that's the general principles. Then we need to talk about Mill specifically, and so we would talk about how you really need to introduce Mill at some point and contrast him to Bentham. So I've done that. What I would do is do that at the start of paragraph 3, and say how he had an issue with Bentham's utilitarianism based on quantity, which led him to higher and lower. Talk about higher and lower then. Paragraph 4, talk about the principle of universalizability, and paragraph 5, rule utilitarianism with specific reference to Mill. So you can see there I've got the general principles of utilitarianism, those first 4 things, and then I've got the distinctive features of Mill's utilitarianism. So I hope that was all useful. Good luck.